All right, it's time to talk about the sprint backlog. We just wrapped up product backlog and product goal. Now it's time to get into the sprint backlog. Todd, what is our big thought here around sprint backlog?
Yeah, I'm going to zero us down in there, and I'm going to put this. It's a plan by and for the developers. I'm going to add on to this a little bit for the current sprint, right? Ooh.
Oh, yeah, for the current sprint. I like that addition, right?
The current sprint.
So this is really, it's a plan that contains the scope and the initial thoughts of the developers and the entire Scrum team on how to start getting those product backlog items to done, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Something that you said there, Todd, that I really want to highlight, that I think it's super important that people have a good understanding of, is that the developers are accountable, right? This is by and for the developers. Like, this is, they own it, which means the developers decide what goes in and out of the sprint backlog. They determine scope, and only they can add to it, and only they can remove things from the sprint backlog. And by they, I mean very clearly the developers.
Yeah, I really like that thought too. And you know, with that, and saying very clearly to the developers, it's the why, what, and the how of the sprint, right? It's the why, what, and the how of the sprint. And so, you know, the commitment to the sprint backlog is the sprint goal, which we'll talk about in a future video. But the sprint backlog is comprised of product backlog items that are selected for a sprint, right? So PBIs, as we talked about during the product backlog section, sprint backlog is comprised of product backlog items selected for the sprint, and the plan for how we're going to get the work done, right? As a group of developers. So the why, what, and the how is all contained within the sprint backlog.
You know, something else important to mention is, just like the product backlog, there's emergence here, right? And so this sprint backlog is going to be updated throughout the sprint as work gets accomplished and more is learned. There's a few events where this could happen. What comes to mind immediately is the daily Scrum, which we'll talk about in future videos. But this sprint backlog can and will be updated. Emergence is alive and well in the sprint backlog as well.
Yeah, and something that's really important with that emergence, Ryan, is to note that it's highly visible, right? There's not a set way that Scrum tells you how to make the sprint backlog highly visible, but it is up to the developers to do that, right? And what we really need as developers is to make sure that the picture of what's happening as new and greater information is learned during a sprint is visible to everybody on the Scrum team, and even people outside of the Scrum team, right? It's up to us in the context of our situation as developers to find a way to make it highly visible.
Yeah, and that visibility is important because this really is a collection of product backlog items selected for this sprint, right? We need to make sure that we remember our rule from the product backlog video, that only the work that comes from the product backlog can be done by a Scrum team. And so these are PBIs. They come into the sprint backlog. This is what the developers believe can be achieved within the context of a sprint. All of these items add to the active product goal that we talked about in the last video. And hopefully by the end of a sprint, all the sprint goal, which we'll talk about in our next video, has been achieved. Some work has gotten done, and some great value delivered to stakeholders.
Yeah, I want to show this emphasis here, Ryan. There's a reason why we have this here twice, right? Product backlog items selected for the sprint. It says selected for the sprint. I think I hit it one way, you hit this another way.
Yep.
It doesn't say committed to for the sprint, right? Product backlog items selected for the sprint. This is deliberately why we wanted to emphasize this. Selected, not committed, right? Because this sprint backlog is emergent. I always think of, Ryan, oh, it's just a little bit of a leak in my ceiling. I can fix it really quick, right? Or I think this will only take me an hour, right? And then 4 days later, you're trying to figure out what went wrong, or maybe how the problem got as complex as it did. That is the complex domain of work. It's selected, not committed. This is product backlog items that are selected for the sprint. Now, we do have a commitment. That's a sprint goal. That's our next video. But it's really dangerous for us to say that product backlog items are committed for in the sprint, and in the sprint backlog that everything needs to be done, because that is not true.
Yeah, really, really important point there, which is why we mentioned it twice. It is the commitment is never to scope in Scrum. It is to our goals. And we'll talk about the sprint goal coming up in the next video. Leave us your comments in the community section of this course. Let us know your thoughts about the sprint backlog. This idea of not or of never committing to scope, or the developers owning scope. Let us know how that works in your current environment. We have a feeling there's some interesting discussions to be had there. But we're going to help with this idea of commitment in our next video on the sprint goal.